This is Module 7. This is Module 7, and this is the period after World War II. So, Module 7 will look at the beginnings of the Cold War. We call this the Cold War and the American Foreign Policy Revolution, 1945 to 1953. In 1945, the world was, World War II had wreaked an enormous amount of destruction. It's estimated that over 60 million people died as a direct result of the war, either as soldiers in combat, as civilians who died in the bombing, people who died from social and political violence, such as the Holocaust, and people who died from malnutrition and disease. The one country, of course, that emerged really strong and virtually unscathed was the United States. And the United States really remained as the most powerful country in the world for a long time. And Americans were very optimistic about the kind of world that they lived in, very optimistic about their abilities to change the world. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, of course, followed the Wilsonian dream of a liberal internationalist globe in which countries of the world considered themselves part of a global community and felt that they had common interests, and that, of course, was not to be. Even though there was a United Nations, which was based in New York City, the great power politics and the concept of spheres of interest continued to dominate international relations. The United States initially had a very optimistic view. In the Roosevelt administration, the American Army was rapidly demobilized and went from 12 million soldiers, 12 million Army personnel, to about 1 or 2 million in a very short period of time. But the Russians, however, did not demobilize. Instead, the Red Army, which was huge, was deployed into Eastern Europe and occupied all of the countries on the western frontier of the Soviet Union. The United States began to grow increasingly concerned, and so Harry Truman, Roosevelt's successor, did not inherit Roosevelt's optimistic view of the world at all. On the contrary, Truman really became increasingly suspicious of the Soviets. The British were also very suspicious. By this time, Britain had a new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. But the old Prime Minister and the Americans both shared a very skeptical, not only skeptical, I would say, apprehensive view towards the Soviet Union. And in 1946, Churchill came over here to the United States and made a famous speech in Fulton, Missouri, in which he said that an iron curtain has descended over Europe. And by that he meant this dividing line between the East and the West. Now, initially, it was not a physical line, but as the relations between the East and the Western Bloc countries grew tense, it became more a place where there was barbed wire and police dogs and checkpoints and barriers of various kinds. The idea of the Soviet Union as a replacement in America's enemies grew in after the Second World War. Dean Acheson was our Secretary of State, and he, along with Truman, was really the architect of this radical new policy in which the United States became actively engaged in the defense of Western Europe. The Latin Americans, of course, wanted the United States to give priority to Latin America, and so the Rio Pact was signed in Rio de Janeiro in 1947, which was an inter-American security system, but it was clear that Washington was as far as their priorities were concerned, primarily concerned with the security of Western Europe and with containing Soviet communism. In 1947, there was a communist uprising in Greece, and Truman went to Congress and asked Congress for military aid to support the anti-communist royalist Greek forces, and also to build up American bases and American military defenses in the Middle East. And so the basic policy of Truman came to be known as the containment policy. Now, in addition to containing the Soviet Union, a major part of the policy also was economic development of Western Europe to preserve social stability and to stop the kind of insecurity that communism seemed to thrive on. And so the Marshall Plan, the economic development of Western Europe, was also a major part of the Truman policy. And so Dean Acheson was our Secretary of State. James Forrestal was the Secretary of Defense. George Marshall was Secretary of State also for a while. And all these men became the architects of this post-war foreign policy that emphasized focusing on the active military defense of Western Europe. Another one of the major figures was George Kennan, who's mentioned in your book. George Kennan was on the American diplomatic delegation in Moscow during the war. He was an admirer of Russian culture, but he became convinced that the Soviet Union was an aggressive, expansionist system that aimed at world domination. And so Kennan wrote a telegram from Moscow called the Long Telegram. He published an article for public consumption in Foreign Affairs magazine, and then he wrote a secret document called NSC 68. All of these basically emphasized and recommended a massive American military buildup to block the Soviet Union. In the Far East, communism steadily gained ground in various parts of East Asia, particularly in China and Vietnam. In Vietnam, a Vietnamese communist named Ho Chi Minh began to fight against the French, who refused to recognize Vietnam as an independent country. And in China, the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, steadily gained ground over the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek. And finally, of course, at the end of 1949, the beginning of 1950, the Communists proclaimed the head of their takeover of the government in China. Back in Europe, the four powers, the Allies, the French, Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union, divided Germany into zones of administration. There was a lot of division about what to do with Germany, but eventually Germany was reunited in the West. The British, French, and American sectors were reunited into a single country, and the Eastern sector was reunited into a single country. The Western part being controlled by the Western powers, the capitalist countries, and the Eastern part controlled by the communists. At the same time, the Russians made probes into the Middle East, particularly into Iran, and there was competition between the Soviets and the Americans for control of Iran. And finally, in the Far East, in